You're lying on cold stone. The air is thick with ammonia and rot. Your wrists are locked in iron, bolted to a wall you can't see because there's no light. Somewhere above you, footsteps, then voices, then laughter. And then you hear it. The sound of liquid splashing against stone, trickling down the wall, pooling near your face. The guards aren't emptying a bucket. They're standing at the grate above your cell, urinating directly onto you. And you realize, with a sinking horror that makes your stomach turn, that this isn't an accident. This isn't neglect. This is the point. Welcome to the reality of medieval castle dungeons, where humiliation wasn't a side effect of imprisonment. It was the architecture itself. You're about to understand how power worked in places where no one was watching, how cruelty became procedure, how the people who designed these spaces knew exactly what they were doing, and why the most terrifying part isn't the torture devices you've heard about. It's the everyday systems of dehumanization that operated like clockwork, every single day, for centuries. If this is gripping you, hit like and subscribe, because the next part gets worse. But before you understand why guards used their own bodies to mark prisoners like animals, you need to understand what a dungeon actually was, not the Hollywood version, the real thing. And more importantly, you need to understand why it was built the way it was, because nothing about these spaces was accidental. The word itself tells you everything. Dungeon comes from the Old French donjon, meaning the great tower, the keep, the strongest point of a castle. The top of the tower was where the lord lived, where power resided, where decisions were made that shaped entire regions. The bottom was where power demonstrated itself. And that bottom wasn't designed for rehabilitation or even punishment in the sense we understand it. It was designed to remove people from the category of human beings entirely. Here's what that meant in practice, and why the details matter. Most medieval dungeons weren't even rooms, they were pits. Oubliettes, from the French oublier, to forget. You were lowered through a trapdoor in the floor above, dropped into a bottle-shaped cavity carved into bedrock, and the door was closed. No stairs, no exit, no light source. The only opening was the hole you came through, and it was above your head, completely out of reach. You were, quite literally, forgotten, left to die in the dark, often without anyone recording that you'd even been there. The Château de Chinon has one of the best preserved examples. The oubliette there is roughly 8 feet deep and 4 feet wide at the bottom, expanding to about 6 feet wide at shoulder height, before narrowing again to a 2-foot opening at the top. The shape is deliberate. You can't climb out. The walls curve away from you. Even if you stacked everything in the cell, even if you stood on another person's shoulders, you couldn't reach the opening. And the narrowing at the top means no light reaches the bottom. You exist in absolute darkness until you stop existing. But here's the thing. Oubliettes were expensive. They required quarrying deep into stone, often through bedrock. They took weeks of skilled labor. They were a statement, a way of saying that this prisoner was so dangerous, so politically toxic, that they needed to be removed from existence itself. The more common solution was simpler and, in many ways, worse. Castle dungeons were built at the lowest point of the structure, below ground level, often beneath the latrines. Not next to them. Beneath them. Think about the logic. Really think about it. Medieval castles were self-contained fortresses designed to withstand months-long sieges. Water came from wells or cisterns built deep into the foundation. Food was stored in granaries and cellars designed to stay cool. Waste had to go somewhere, and it couldn't contaminate the water supply. The latrine system was engineering, a vertical shaft built into the castle walls, with openings on every floor where residents could relieve themselves. Gravity did the rest. Everything flowed downward, through the shaft, and pooled at the bottom. And at the bottom, in many documented cases across Europe, were the holding cells. This wasn't poor planning. This was intentional design. The castle at Loches, France, built in the 11th century by the Count of Anjou, is the textbook example. The dungeons sit directly under the latrine system. Multiple shafts converge above the cell block. The Château de Chinon, where the Knights Templar were held in the early 1300s during their persecution by King Philip IV of France, has the same design. So does Warwick Castle in England, where political prisoners of the Wars of the Roses were held in the 1400s. So does the Tower of London's underground levels, particularly the section beneath the White Tower. The Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, originally built as a mausoleum for the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century of the Common Era, but converted into a fortress and prison by the medieval papacy, has cells positioned directly beneath the papal apartment's waste system. This pattern repeats across Europe, across centuries, across different kingdoms, different architectural traditions, different legal systems, which means this wasn't coincidence. This wasn't accidental evolution. This was blueprint. This was best practice. This was what you did when you built a castle and needed to hold prisoners. Now watch what happens when you combine architecture with authority. You're a prisoner in the dungeon of Loches. The year is 1431. You're accused of treason against the Duke of Anjou. The specifics don't matter because there won't be a trial. You've been in this cell for 6 weeks. The floor is damp, perpetually wet from condensation and seepage from the earth around you. The walls are slick with something you don't want to identify, a combination of moisture, mold, and the accumulated filth of decades. You can hear the castle above you, the everyday sounds of life. Boots on stone, doors closing, voices echoing through the thick walls, the clang of the kitchen, the bark of dogs in the courtyard. And every few hours the shaft above your cell gurgles and waste rains down. Human waste, kitchen refuse, dirty water from washing, blood from the butchering of animals for the Lord's table. All of it flowing through those vertical channels and splashing into your space. The smell alone is enough to make you vomit, except you stopped vomiting after the first week because there's nothing left in your stomach. The bread they bring you once a day is hard as stone and often moldy. The water is brackish and warm. You're losing weight. You can feel your teeth loosening in your gums from scurvy. Your skin is covered in sores from lying on wet stone. You haven't seen sunlight in 42 days. But that's not even the intentional part. The intentional part is what the guards do when they arrive. When they bring you water or bread, which they do just often enough to keep you alive, they don't simply open the door and leave. They assert their position. They remind you of where you are in the hierarchy. And one of the most common, most documented ways they did this was through urination, directly onto prisoners, directly into cells, while making eye contact, while laughing, while discussing what they were going to eat for dinner, or how the weather was outside, or which servant girl they'd been with the night before. This is recorded in multiple sources, and the consistency of the accounts across time and geography is what makes it undeniable. The Templar confessions extracted at Chinon in the year 1307 and 1308 mention guards fouling the air and the accused as a form of preliminary intimidation before interrogation. The Chronicle of Jean Froissart, writing in the late 1300s about the 100 Years' War, describes prisoners in English dungeons being treated as less than dogs, with the guards marking their territory upon them as animals do. The Venetian ambassador to France, Marco Foscari, in 1512, wrote a letter back to the Doge describing a political prisoner held beneath the royal apartments at the Château d'Amboise, where the guards amuse themselves by relieving their bladders upon him through the floor above. And he has no recourse, for who would hear a traitor's complaint? The diary of a German castle steward, Heinrich von Strassburg, from approximately 1470, includes an entry about the dungeons beneath Hohenzollern Castle, where he matter-of-factly records that the prisoners are kept beneath the guardroom, and the men make use of them as is customary. Not as is cruel, as is customary, as is normal, as is what everyone does. A Spanish Inquisition record from Toledo, dated 1593, describes holding cells beneath the tribunal chambers, where the accused are reminded of their lowly state by the natural functions of those who judge them, delivered from above. And that's when you realize this wasn't rogue behavior. This wasn't a few sadistic individuals. This was policy. This was culture. This was how the system worked. Because here's what the system understood that we've forgotten. Imprisonment in the medieval period wasn't about reform. It wasn't even primarily about punishment in the retributive sense. It was about demonstration. Demonstrating that you had been removed from the social order, that you no longer possessed the dignity that separated humans from livestock, that the people in power could do anything to you, and no one would stop them, and no one would even remember it happened. Urination was the perfect tool for this because it required no equipment, no approval, no paperwork, no authorization from a higher authority. It was intimate. It was degrading. It was immediate. It was visceral. And it was renewable. A guard could do it multiple times a day, every day, without effort, without cost, without exhaustion. It became routine. Think about the logic of routine. Really sit with this. When cruelty becomes procedure, it stops feeling like cruelty to the people administering it. It becomes part of the job. You're not torturing someone. You're processing them. You're maintaining order. You're doing what your predecessor did, and what your replacement will do, and what everyone in the castle expects you to do. The act becomes invisible to the perpetrator, even as it defines the victim's entire existence. This is what happened in castle dungeons across Europe for roughly 3 centuries. The period from approximately 1200 to 1500, the high and late medieval era, is when castle construction peaked and when centralized monarchies began using imprisonment as a tool of control, rather than just holding people temporarily before execution. Before that period, most justice was swift: execution, mutilation, exile, public shaming. After that period, the development of formal prison systems and the beginnings of Enlightenment legal philosophy introduced at least the concept of oversight, of rules, of documentation. But in between, there was a window where dungeons operated as black sites, where the only limit on what could be done to prisoners was the creativity of the guards and the structural design of the building, and the buildings were designed to enable this. Let's go deeper into the architecture, because the architecture is the confession. The architecture is the part that can't lie. A standard medieval dungeon cell was approximately 6 feet by 8 feet. The ceiling was often less than 6 feet high, forcing most prisoners to stoop or crouch. There were no windows in the traditional sense. If there was an opening at all, it was a slit no more than 3 inches wide, cut into stone that was often 3 feet thick, angled upward so that no direct light entered the cell. The purpose of this opening wasn't ventilation or illumination. It was to allow sound to travel, so prisoners could hear the world outside, so they could hear freedom and know they would never reach it, so they could hear normal life continuing without them: children playing, merchants calling their wares, church bells marking the hours, festivals and celebrations and weddings and funerals. Everything that meant you were part of human society, happening just out of reach. The floor was bare stone, sometimes with a drain cut into the corner. That drain is important. It tells you the designers knew there would be liquid, lots of it. Blood from beatings, yes. Water from flooding, yes, because dungeons were often below the water table and would fill during heavy rain, sometimes to a depth of 6 inches or more. But also urine and feces. From the prisoners, obviously, because there was no toilet, no bucket, nothing. You relieved yourself in the corner and hoped it reached the drain. But the drain was sized for volume, for continuous flow from multiple sources, which suggests it was expected from above as well. Some dungeons had what were called murder holes in the ceiling. Small openings, usually covered with an iron grate, that allowed guards to observe prisoners without entering the cell and exposing themselves to potential attack. But they also allowed guards to drop things: refuse, waste, boiling water in some cases, if a prisoner became too troublesome. Themselves, in the sense we're discussing. Now the next one gets worse, because it reveals the level of planning involved. At the Château de Pierrefonds, rebuilt in the late 1400s by Jean de Dormans and later by Louis d'Orléans, the dungeon level includes a series of cells directly beneath the guardroom. The guardroom floor has drainage channels built into it, deliberate grooves cut into the stone floor, and those channels terminate in grates positioned directly over the cells below. There's no ambiguity here. This is plumbing designed to deliver the contents of the guardroom floor into the cells beneath. And what would be on the floor of a room where guards spent their shifts, where they ate and drank and gambled and slept? Everything you'd expect from a room full of men with no other facilities immediately available. The architecture makes the guards' bodies into weapons of confinement. The Tower of London has a similar setup in the cells beneath the Beauchamp Tower. The guardroom above has drainage that flows directly into the cells. In some cases, the grates are still visible, rusted and ancient, but undeniable in their purpose. Warwick Castle's dungeons include cells where you can still see, if you visit today, the staining on the walls. Chemical analysis done in the 1990s confirmed what everyone already knew. The stains are from centuries of accumulated urine and feces, both human and animal, that flowed down from the levels above. And here's what makes this especially chilling. It worked across cultures and time zones. This wasn't just a European phenomenon. This wasn't specific to Christianity or feudalism or any particular political system. Japanese castle dungeons in the Edo period, roughly 1600 to 1868, have documented cases of prisoners being held beneath latrines as a form of status degradation. The castle at Himeji, one of the best preserved examples of Japanese castle architecture, has underground cells positioned beneath the waste system. Records from the domain of Okayama describe prisoners being held in filth pits, where the samurai guards demonstrated their superiority through natural dominance. Chinese imperial prisons in the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, used similar architectural humiliation. The prisons beneath the Forbidden City in Beijing included cells where political prisoners and disgraced officials were held under the palace latrines. A memorial from the Wanli Emperor's reign, late 1500s, complains about the smell from the prison level and suggests moving it, but the suggestion was rejected specifically because the degradation of prisoners was considered necessary. The Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, used as a papal prison from the 10th century onward, has the same design. The dungeons beneath Edinburgh Castle, documented from the 1600s but likely older, have cells positioned beneath what were clearly waste channels. The Doge's Palace in Venice, with its famous Pazzi dungeons, the wells, built in the 1500s but replacing earlier structures, include cells that flood not just with water from the canals, but with overflow from the building above. The pattern is global. The pattern is consistent, which means this wasn't accidental evolution. This was recognized as effective. Effective at breaking people. Effective at maintaining hierarchies. Effective at turning imprisonment into a form of social death. Think about what it does to you psychologically. Think about the cumulative effect. You can endure physical pain. Humans are astonishingly resilient to physical pain. The body has mechanisms for dealing with pain. Endorphins, shock, eventual numbness. You can endure hunger, cold, isolation. People have survived years in solitary confinement. People have survived starvation. People have survived conditions that should have killed them. But you cannot endure the systematic destruction of your dignity. You cannot endure being treated as a receptacle for someone else's waste without beginning to internalize that treatment. The guards knew this. The lords who designed the dungeons knew this. The architects who drew up the plans knew this. The entire system was built on this knowledge. There's a reason we use the phrase treated like dirt. Dirt is beneath. Dirt is where waste goes. Dirt is what you step on without thinking, what you scrape off your boots, what you sweep out of your house. When you put someone in a hole and urinate on them, you're enacting that metaphor literally. You're placing them beneath you in every possible sense, physically, legally, morally, socially, existentially. And the psychological research, centuries later, confirms what medieval authorities already understood intuitively. Humiliation is more damaging to the human psyche than physical torture. Physical wounds heal. Broken bones knit together. Burns scar over. Lacerations close. But the wound of being dehumanized, of being stripped of the basic dignities that separate humans from objects or animals, that wound stays open. It redefines how you see yourself. It changes your relationship to your own body. It makes you complicit in your own degradation because eventually, on some level, you begin to believe you deserve it. This is what the dungeon system was designed to produce. Not corpses. Not confessions, necessarily, though those were often extracted. But broken people. People who understood, in their bodies and their minds and their souls, that they had been expelled from the human community. People who would never challenge authority again, even if they were released. People who would serve as living warnings to others. And many of them were released. That's the part we forget. That's the part that makes the system make sense. Dungeons weren't execution chambers. Execution was public. Execution was theater. Execution was performed in town squares and castle courtyards where everyone could see. The whole point of execution was visibility, demonstration, the creation of a spectacle that reinforced the power of the state. Dungeons were the before and the after. You were held there before trial or execution, or you were held there after your sentence as a permanent demonstration of the Lord's power. But some prisoners did eventually leave. Political prisoners especially were often released once the political situation changed, once alliances shifted, once a ransom was paid, once a treaty was signed, and those people carried the dungeon with them for the rest of their lives. There are accounts of former prisoners who couldn't sleep in beds because they'd spent years on stone, and their bodies had adapted, who flinched at the sound of footsteps above them, who couldn't bear enclosed spaces, who washed themselves obsessively, compulsively, trying to wash away sensations that no longer existed, scrubbing their skin raw in an attempt to remove the memory of degradation. Medieval writers didn't have the vocabulary of trauma, didn't have terms like post-traumatic stress disorder or disassociation or psychological scarring, but they recorded the symptoms, the nightmares, the fear of shadows. The way former prisoners would sometimes freeze when someone approached from behind. The inability to make eye contact with authority figures. The way they would cringe or flinch at sudden movements. The poet Charles d'Orléans, who was held in the Tower of London for 25 years after being captured at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, wrote after his release about the darkness that lives in daylight and the stains that water cannot wash. He never specified what he meant, but everyone who read his work understood. The Italian political philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli, who was imprisoned and tortured in the dungeons beneath the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence in 1513, wrote in a letter after his release that there are degradations worse than death, and a wise prince knows how to use them. He was describing his own experience, turning his trauma into political theory. But here's the revelation that ties everything together, the thing the title has been promising you. The thing that makes all of this worse than simple cruelty. The guards weren't sadists. That's the easy answer. The one that lets us distance ourselves. The one that lets us say, well, those were different times, those were bad people. We would never do that. The truth is harder. The guards were ordinary men doing a job in a system that required prisoners to be dehumanized in order to function. And urination, specifically, wasn't just cruelty. It wasn't just domination. It was a form of institutional communication. It was language. Animals mark territory with urine. It's a chemical signal. Pheromones and scent markers that say, this is mine. This is my domain. You are not my equal. You are beneath me in the hierarchy. You do not belong here. When guards urinated on prisoners, they were enacting that same ritual. They were marking the cell, the prisoner, the entire dungeon as their territory. They were reminding the prisoner, with every act, that they existed at the guard's discretion, that their bodies were not their own, that they had been reclassified from human to thing, from person to property, from citizen to animal. And the system wanted this. The system needed this. The system could not function without this. Because if you're going to hold people in conditions that would make most modern prisons look humane, conditions where disease and malnutrition and abuse are constant, you need the guards to see the prisoners as less than human. If the guards saw the prisoners as people like themselves, as fathers or brothers or sons, as individuals with histories and futures and loved ones waiting for them, the system would collapse. Empathy would break the machine, compassion would jam the gears. So the machine was designed to prevent empathy, to make degradation routine, to turn guards into actors in a ritual of dominance that predated them and would continue after they left. The architecture made this inevitable. When you place cells beneath latrines, when you build drainage channels from guard rooms into cells, when you create spaces where waste flows downward onto prisoners, you're not leaving cruelty to chance. You're not hoping that sadistic individuals will volunteer. You're building it into the infrastructure. You're ensuring that even guards who might otherwise hesitate, who might otherwise feel uncomfortable, who might otherwise question what they're doing, will participate. Because the building itself is already participating. The waste is already flowing from the castle above. The prisoners are already being covered in filth. All the guard has to do is add to the flow. It becomes a collective act, diffused across the structure and across the institution, so that no single person feels fully responsible. This is the blueprint of institutional cruelty. You don't rely on individual sadism. You don't depend on finding people who enjoy causing pain. You design a system where the default option is harm, where doing nothing already hurts people, where participating requires less effort than resisting, where the path of least resistance is also the path of maximum degradation. And then you let human psychology do the rest. You let conformity and routine and institutional culture turn ordinary people into instruments of systematic dehumanization. The medieval dungeon perfected this, and the model never went away. It just got more sophisticated, more bureaucratic, more abstract. But the core logic remained. Look at the history of imprisonment from the 1600s forward. Look at what happened when people supposedly learned better. The first modern prisons, the ones built in the Enlightenment era, the 17 and 1800s, were supposed to be reforms. No more dungeons, no more degradation, no more arbitrary cruelty. Just cells, and work, and discipline, and rehabilitation. The Quakers in Pennsylvania designed a system they called penitentiary, a place where criminals would become penitent, where they would reflect on their sins and emerge reformed. But what actually happened? The Auburn system in New York, introduced in 1816, enforced total silence on prisoners and had them work in lockstep, their bodies controlled by bells and guards and arbitrary rules. Prisoners couldn't speak, couldn't look at each other, couldn't deviate from the routine by even a second. The punishment for breaking silence was whipping. The punishment for looking at another prisoner was solitary confinement. The system broke people just as effectively as any medieval dungeon. Just more quietly, just with more paperwork. The Pennsylvania system, introduced around the same time, placed prisoners in total isolation, alone in cells where they couldn't see or hear other human beings, alone with their thoughts and their guilt and their slowly disintegrating minds. The cells had small skylights, the famous eyes of God, that let in just enough light to read the Bible they were given. That was the only book allowed. That was the only connection to anything outside their own heads. Prisoners went insane. They hallucinated. They mutilated themselves. They beat their heads against the walls until they lost consciousness. Charles Dickens visited Eastern State Penitentiary in 1842 and wrote that the isolation was cruel and wrong, and that he believed it to inflict immense amounts of torture and agony. But the system continued. Because it worked. Because it broke people. Because it demonstrated power. And the urination? It persisted. The specific act, the specific form of degradation, continued across centuries. In American prisons in the Jim Crow South, from the 1870s through the 1960s, guards regularly urinated on black prisoners as a form of racial dominance, as a way of reinforcing the hierarchy that slavery had established and that prison was designed to maintain. This is documented in testimony from former prisoners, in civil rights investigations, in court cases. In Soviet gulags, from the 1920s through the 1950s, guards used waste as a weapon of control, as a way of breaking political prisoners who might otherwise maintain their dignity. Alexander Solzhenitsyn describes this in The Gulag Archipelago. In contemporary detention centers around the world, there are documented cases from human rights organizations of prisoners being held in cells where toilet facilities are inadequate or deliberately withheld, forcing degradation, forcing prisoners to soil themselves, forcing them to choose between thirst and drinking contaminated water. The technology changes, the vocabulary changes, the legal framework changes, but the pattern remains. Take people. Remove their dignity. Make it systematic. Make it routine. Make it so that the people administering it don't have to think of themselves as cruel. Make it so that the cruelty is built into the structure rather than the individual. Make it so that everyone involved can say, I was just doing my job, I was just following procedure, I was just maintaining order. And here's the final piece, the one that makes all of this matter right now, the one that connects the medieval dungeon to today. The medieval dungeon wasn't an aberration. It wasn't a relic of a more brutal age that we've moved past. It was a laboratory. It was a testing ground. It was where power learned how to break people efficiently, how to use architecture and routine and the guard's own body as instruments of control. Everything we've built since, every prison system, every detention facility, every jail, every place where the state holds people against their will, is downstream from that laboratory. The specifics change. The core logic doesn't. When you put someone in a cage and systematically strip them of dignity, you're not punishing them. You're not rehabilitating them. You're not protecting society. You're reclassifying them. You're performing a ritual that says, you are no longer part of us. You are no longer human in the way that counts. And once that reclassification happens, anything becomes possible. Anything becomes routine. Anything becomes justifiable. The guards at Loches and Chinon and the Tower of London understood this. The architects who placed dungeons beneath latrines understood this. The lords who paid for it all, who commissioned the construction and hired the guards and maintained the system, understood this. They built a machine that made cruelty invisible to the people committing it. And that machine worked so well, was so efficient at breaking people while maintaining the operator's sense of normalcy, that we've never really stopped using it. We've refined it. We've made it cleaner. We've added layers of bureaucracy and oversight and legal process. We've wrapped it in the language of justice and public safety and rehabilitation. But the core remains. The dungeon remains. The logic of systematic dehumanization remains. So the next time you hear about conditions in a modern prison, about prisoners held in isolation for decades, about cells with no sanitation, about buildings where the guards treat inmates as less than human, about systems where cruelty has become so routine that no one even notices it anymore. Remember the dungeon. Remember that this isn't new. Remember that this isn't accidental. This is the blueprint. And the blueprint was designed to work exactly this well. That's the history they don't teach you. That's the architecture of power when no one's watching. That's the machine that turns ordinary people into instruments of systematic cruelty. And that's why it matters that you understand it. Because the dungeon never went away. It just learned to hide better. It just learned to dress itself up in the language of law and order. It just learned to diffuse responsibility so thoroughly that everyone involved can sleep at night. But the prisoners can't sleep. They never could. Not in the dungeons of Locks in 1431. Not in the cells of Auburn in 1830. Not in the isolation units of today. The machine keeps running. The machine keeps breaking people. And the machine keeps telling itself that it's doing something necessary, something justified, something other than what it actually is. If this shook something loose in your understanding of power and cruelty, hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell me, what historical practice do you think laid the groundwork for a modern abuse? Because next time, we're going into the monastery cellars where monks starved each other to death as punishment for sin, and the theological justification is somehow worse than the act itself. You'll want to be here for that. And that is what really happened.